He was the ghost of New York's most ruthless crime family, a mute heir sitting in the shadows of a glittering gala, treated like broken furniture by his own blood, until she walked across the room, looked him dead in the eye, and let her hands do the talking. The grand ballroom of the Santoro estate in Oyster Bay was a masterclass in deception. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the 300 guests, illuminating silk gowns, bespoke tuxedos, and the flash of diamonds. A string quartet played a delicate Vivaldi piece in the corner, masking the sound of backroom deals and hushed threats. This was the annual Santoro Foundation Charity Gala, a highly publicized event designed to wash the blood off the family's name and present them as legitimate pillars of the community. Audrey Miller stood near a towering ice sculpture, nursing a flute of champagne she had no intention of drinking. At 26, she was an anomaly in this room. She wasn't an heiress, a politician's daughter, or a mobster's trophy. She was a sign language interpreter and a special education specialist, dragged to this lion's den by her best friend, Sarah, an ambitious event planner who had scored the contract of the year. "Don't stare, Audrey," Sarah hissed, materializing at her side with a forced, practiced smile. "That's Senator Grantham over there, and the man pouring him the Macallan 25. That's Vincent Santoro, the boss." Audrey's eyes flicked to the patriarch of the Santoro family. Vincent was a massive man in his early 60s, radiating a terrifying, gravitational pull. When he laughed, the men around him laughed louder. When he frowned, the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Beside him stood his eldest son, Dominic. Dominic was the golden boy, the heir apparent. He possessed the sharp, predatory good looks of a movie star, but his eyes were entirely dead. He moved through the crowd with an arrogant swagger, commanding respect through fear. But Audrey's attention wasn't on the men running the room. It was on the man the room was pretending didn't exist. Seated in a velvet armchair in the darkest alcove of the ballroom was Gabriel Santoro. He was 24, the youngest son of the Santoro Empire, but he might as well have been a ghost. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue suit, but he was slouched, his posture defensive. A jagged, faded scar peeked out from the collar of his shirt, trailing up the side of his neck, a brutal reminder of a kidnapping by a rival cartel in Palermo when he was 12. The cartel hadn't gotten their ransom in time. By the time Vincent's men breached the compound, Gabriel's vocal cords had been permanently severed. Since that day, Gabriel hadn't spoken a single word, and in the brutal, hyper-masculine world of the Cosa Nostra, a man without a voice was a man without power. Audrey watched in quiet horror as the evening unfolded around him. A waiter carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres accidentally backed into Gabriel's chair. Instead of apologizing, the waiter merely glanced back, saw who it was, and rolled his eyes before hurrying away. A few minutes later, 2 women draped in designer jewelry stood mere inches from Gabriel, loudly gossiping about his father's impending indictment, treating Gabriel as if he were a marble statue, incapable of comprehension. "It's a tragedy, really," Sarah whispered, noticing where Audrey was looking. "They say he's damaged goods. The father barely acknowledges him.
Dominic treats him like a burden. Everyone just ignores him. He's mute, Sarah. He isn't deaf. And he certainly isn't stupid, Audrey replied, her chest tightening with an unfamiliar, fierce indignation. Audrey observed Gabriel closer. While the room dismissed him, Gabriel was anything but checked out. His dark, piercing eyes tracked everything. He noticed when the head of the Lucchese Russo syndicate subtly slipped a folded piece of paper into Mayor Richard's pocket. He noticed when Dominic's hand lingered a little too long on the waist of a rival boss's wife. Gabriel's hands, resting on his knees, twitched in rhythmic, almost imperceptible motions. Audrey's breath hitched. She recognized those twitches. He was signing to himself. It was fragmented, subtle, disguised as mere fidgeting. But Audrey's trained eyes caught the frantic, sharp movements of ASL. Liars. Snakes. Blood on the floor. He was narrating the room. He was screaming in a language no one around him understood. "I'll be right back," Audrey said, setting her champagne flute down on a passing tray. "Audrey, wait. What are you doing?" Sarah panicked, grabbing her arm. "You do not cross the room to talk to the Santoros. You just don't." "I'm not talking to the Santoros," Audrey said smoothly, pulling her arm free. "I'm talking to Gabriel." The walk across the ballroom felt like crossing a battlefield. The closer Audrey got to the dark alcove, the more the temperature seemed to drop. People naturally created a wide perimeter around Gabriel, treating his silence like a contagious disease. When Audrey finally stepped out of the glittering light and into the shadows of his corner, she felt the immediate, heavy weight of his gaze. Gabriel looked up. Up close, his features were strikingly aristocratic, sharper and more refined than Dominic's. But it was his eyes that caught her off guard. They were a deep, stormy grey, filled with a cynical, exhausted intelligence. He looked at her the way one might look at a bird that had accidentally flown into a closed window, with a mixture of pity and mild curiosity. He didn't move. He just waited for her to realize her mistake and walk away, just like everyone else always did. Instead, Audrey stopped directly in front of him. She offered a warm, genuine smile, raised her hands, and began to speak with her fingers. "Hello, my name is Audrey. It looks like you're the only person in this room actually paying attention." Gabriel went entirely still. The rhythmic tapping of his fingers against his knee ceased instantly. For a fraction of a second, the carefully constructed mask of apathy he wore shattered, revealing raw, unadulterated shock. His stormy grey eyes darted to her hands, then up to her face, searching for the punchline of a cruel joke. When he found none, a deep, cautious furrow appeared on his brow. Slowly, he lifted his hands. His movements were rusty, hesitant, like a man speaking a foreign language he hadn't practiced in a decade. "You sign." His signs were sharp, masculine, but infused with an undeniable elegance. "I do," Audrey signed back, keeping her movements smooth and conversational, projecting an ease she didn't entirely feel. "I'm a special education teacher. I work mainly with non-verbal kids, but I also notice when someone is calling the mayor a snake from across the room." A ghost of a smirk played at the corner of Gabriel's lips. It transformed his face entirely, stripping away the brooding mob-air exterior and revealing something surprisingly boyish and dangerously charming. You were watching me, he signed, his gestures becoming more fluid as his confidence returned. Everyone else is ignoring you. It seemed like a terrible waste of a good conversation, Audrey replied.
Gabriel's expression darkened slightly, the smirk vanishing. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his massive hands weaving a rapid, intense warning in the air. You shouldn't be over here. People who talk to the ghost of the Santoro family end up becoming ghosts themselves. It's bad for your health, Audrey. I'm not easily intimidated, Audrey signed back, though her heart was pounding against her ribs. And you aren't a ghost. You're just surrounded by people who are too arrogant to learn how to listen. Gabriel stared at her, an intense, searching look that made Audrey feel as though he was reading the very marrow of her bones. For 10 years, he had existed in a glass box. He possessed the most dangerous commodity in the criminal underworld, information. Because everyone assumed his broken voice meant a broken mind, men discussed murders, extortions, and betrayals right in front of him. He carried the sins of the entire New York underworld in his head, entirely alone, until this woman in a simple emerald green dress walked up and shattered the glass. You are brave. Or foolish, Gabriel signed, his hands moving with a heavy, magnetic grace. But my brother is looking this way, and you do not want Dominic's attention. Audrey glanced over her shoulder. Sure enough, Dominic Santoro had paused his conversation with a state judge. His dark eyes were locked on Audrey and Gabriel, narrowed in malicious curiosity. He whispered something to one of his bodyguards, excused himself, and began striding across the ballroom toward them. Don't react, Gabriel signed rapidly, his eyes flashing with sudden urgency. Whatever he says, agree and walk away. Do not defend me. Before Audrey could reply, Dominic arrived. The smell of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke rolled off him in waves. Well, well, Dominic purred, his voice a smooth, oily baritone. He stepped into Audrey's personal space, forcing her to look up at him. I don't believe we've had the pleasure. I'm Dominic. Audrey, she said, keeping her voice perfectly polite and devoid of the tremor she felt inside. Audrey. Dominic tested the name on his tongue, his eyes raking over her in a way that made her skin crawl. He didn't even glance at Gabriel. Tell me, Audrey, what is a beautiful woman like you doing in the dark corner with the family pet? Did he spill something on you? He's clumsy, half blind, half deaf, and completely mute. Dominic finally looked down at his brother, a cruel, mocking sneer twisting his handsome features. Right, Gabe. Just taking up space. Gabriel didn't react. He stared blankly ahead, letting his shoulders slump slightly, playing the exact role of the defeated, broken brother that Dominic expected. But out of Dominic's line of sight, hidden by the angle of his body, Gabriel's left hand signed a single, sharp word against his thigh. Wait. Audrey felt a surge of pure anger. She wanted to scream at Dominic. She wanted to slap the smug look off his face. But she remembered Gabriel's warning. She forced a light, dismissive laugh. Not at all. Audrey lied smoothly. I simply needed a moment away from the crowd. My shoes are killing me, and this corner seemed quiet. Dominic chuckled, clearly satisfied that Audrey was dismissing his brother just like everyone else. Well, the VIP lounge upstairs is much more comfortable, and it has better company. Why don't you let me get you a fresh drink? I'd love to, but I actually need to find my friend. We were just about to head out, Audrey said, taking a deliberate step back. Dominic's eyes hardened for a fraction of a second at the rejection, but he masked it quickly with a slick smile. A shame. Next time, Audrey. Keep out of the shadows. It's no place for a pretty girl. He patted Gabriel forcefully on the cheek, a deeply demeaning, patronizing gesture, and turned on his heel, walking back toward his father's inner circle. Audrey stood frozen, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. She looked down at Gabriel. The submissive, broken facade had instantly melted away. The raw, predatory rage in his grey eyes was so terrifying that Audrey almost took a step back. This wasn't a broken man. This was a caged tiger, biding his time. Slowly, Gabriel raised his hands. His signs were no longer conversational. They were sharp, commanding, and laced with a terrifying urgency. Listen to me very carefully, Gabriel signed, locking eyes with her. Audrey nodded, raising her own hands. I'm listening. You need to find your friend. Right now. You need to walk to the valet, get your car, and drive away from Oyster Bay. Audrey frowned, her hands moving frantically. Why? What's happening? Gabriel glanced at his father, then at Dominic, before turning his piercing gaze back to Audrey. The secret he had been carrying all night, the bloodbath he had overheard his father planning against the Russo syndicate in the very room they were standing in, was about to begin. The east gates are already locked shut, Gabriel signed, his face a mask of absolute, chilling calm. The valet leaves at exactly 11. It is 10:45. At 11:15, the men disguised as waiters are going to pull the shotguns taped under the catering tables. Audrey's breath stopped. The color drained completely from her face. Go, Gabriel commanded with his hands, his eyes pleading with her for the first time. If you stay, you die. Run, Audrey. Audrey's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of polite indifference. Gabriel's eyes, stormy, desperate, and terrifyingly calm, held hers for one final, silent second before he looked away, slipping effortlessly back into his slouched, broken posture. The ghost had returned to his haunting. Audrey turned and walked back into the glittering fray. Every sense was dialed up to a blinding intensity. The Vivaldi string arrangement now sounded like a funeral dirge. She looked at the waiters circling the room with silver platters. Earlier, they had seemed like invisible staff. Now, she noticed the bulky, unnatural lines beneath their tailored black vests. She noticed the way they communicated with subtle nods, positioning themselves near the heavy oak doors and the exits. It was 10:48 p.m. She spotted Sarah near the champagne fountain, animatedly talking to a man Audrey recognized from the news as an underboss for the Genovese crime family. Audrey didn't hesitate. She marched directly up to her friend, grabbed her by the elbow, and squeezed hard. Sarah, we have to go. Right now, Audrey said, her voice tight but low enough not to carry. Sarah blinked, startled by the intrusion. Audrey, what are you doing? I'm in the middle of a... You're having a severe allergic reaction to the crab-stuffed mushrooms, and I have your EpiPen in the car. Audrey lied flawlessly, digging her nails into Sarah's arm. We are leaving. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from Audrey's eyes silenced her. Mumbling a confused apology to the underboss, Sarah let herself be dragged across the ballroom. "Have you lost your mind?" Sarah hissed as they pushed through the heavy mahogany doors into the grand foyer. "This is the most important night of my career. If we stay here, you won't have a career. You won't have a pulse," Audrey whispered fiercely, pushing Sarah toward the coat check. They stepped out into the crisp, biting October air. It was 10:54 p.m. The circular driveway was chaotic, a fleet of black town cars and luxury sedans idling in the cold. A valet with a thick neck tattoo, a known associate of the Colombo family, Audrey realized with a sickening jolt, was aggressively waving a departing senator's car down the drive. "My car, the silver Lexus." "Now," Audrey demanded, shoving her ticket at the valet. The man sneered, taking his time. "Hold your horses, lady. We're busy." Audrey glanced back at the sprawling mansion. Through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see Dominic Santoro, standing on a balcony overlooking the ballroom, a sick, anticipatory smile playing on his lips. He checked his gold Rolex. 10:57 p.m. "Give me the keys. I'll get it myself," Audrey snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Startled by her ferocity, the valet tossed the keys. Audrey grabbed Sarah, practically shoving her into the passenger seat before diving behind the wheel. The engine roared to life. Audrey slammed her foot on the gas, the tires squealing against the cobblestone driveway. As they sped toward the perimeter of the Oyster Bay estate, Audrey saw 3 men in dark suits hauling the massive wrought-iron east gates shut. They were locking the guests inside. "Hold on," Audrey yelled. She didn't brake. She accelerated, aiming the Lexus straight for the rapidly closing gap. The men shouted, reaching for their waistbands, but Audrey didn't flinch. The Lexus shot through the opening with mere inches to spare, the metal gates clanging shut with a terrifying finality just behind their rear bumper. They were out. Audrey drove for 2 miles in dead silence, her hands trembling so violently she could barely grip the leather steering wheel. She pulled over onto a dark, secluded ridge that overlooked the distant Santoro estate, cutting the engine and the headlights. "Audrey, what the hell was that?" Sarah whimpered, finally finding her voice, tears streaming down her face. "Why did we run?" Audrey didn't answer. She kept her eyes glued to the glowing mansion in the valley below. The digital clock on the dashboard clicked. 11:15 p.m. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, the lights in the east wing of the mansion suddenly extinguished. A second later, the muffled, rapid popping sounds echoed across the water. Pop, pop, pop. It sounded like firecrackers. But Audrey knew the truth. It was the sound of shotguns and suppressed submachine guns tearing through the ballroom. Chaos erupted in the valley. Distant screams carried on the wind. 2 separate explosions blew the grand ballroom windows outward in a shower of glittering glass, sending plumes of black smoke into the night sky. Sarah clamped her hands over her mouth, sobbing hysterically. "Oh my God. Oh my God. We were just in there. Audrey sat paralyzed, staring at the inferno. She had escaped, but as the distant sirens began to wail, a cold, heavy stone formed in her stomach. Gabriel was still in there, the mute prince, trapped in the shadows of a slaughterhouse. She squeezed her eyes shut. The phantom image of his hands signing the word "run" burned permanently into her mind. The news cycle for the next 72 hours was a relentless, bloody spectacle. Sitting in her cramped, dimly lit Brooklyn apartment, Audrey watched the television screen with hollow, exhausted eyes. The headlines blared in bold red letters. Oyster Bay Massacre. Santoro Syndicate decimated. The official reports were chaotic, but the criminal underworld's truth slowly leaked to the press. It wasn't a rival gang that had attacked the Santoros. It was an inside job. Dominic Santoro, tired of waiting for his aging father to step down, had allied with the Lucchese Russo syndicate to orchestrate a coup. Vincent Santoro was dead, gunned down near the ice sculpture. Dozens of mob bosses, capos, and corrupt politicians had been caught in the crossfire. But the most shocking news was Dominic himself. He hadn't survived to claim the throne. According to the reports, Dominic had been found executed in the VIP lounge, shot twice in the back of the head. The entire Santoro leadership was wiped out. There was no mention of Gabriel. He was, as always, invisible. Rain lashed against Audrey's living room window. She hadn't slept in 3 days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ballroom. She saw Dominic's cruel sneer. She saw Gabriel's stormy grey eyes. A sudden sharp knock at her front door made Audrey jump, her heart leaping into her throat. It was 2 a.m. No one knocked at 2 a.m. unless they brought bad news. Audrey crept toward the door, holding her breath. She peered through the peephole. The hallway was dark, the bulb having burned out weeks ago, but a flash of lightning illuminated the corridor just enough for her to see the silhouette of a tall, broad-shouldered man in a drenched black trench coat. She unbolted the deadbolt, her hands shaking, and pulled the door open a few inches, leaving the chain engaged. Gabriel stood in the hallway. He was soaked to the bone, water dripping from his dark hair. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes bruised and deep, but he was alive. There was no trace of the slouched, submissive boy from the gala. He stood tall, a dark, commanding presence that seemed to swallow the light in the hallway. He looked at her through the crack in the door, raised his hands, and signed a single word. Safe? Audrey let out a choked breath, her relief so profound it made her knees weak. She fumbled with the chain, sliding it free, and pulled the door wide open. "Come in," she whispered. Gabriel stepped inside, bringing the cold smell of rain and expensive leather with him. He stood awkwardly in her small living room, looking entirely out of place among her thrift store furniture and stacks of textbooks. "You survived," Audrey signed, her hands trembling as she formed the words. Gabriel watched her hands, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. Then he raised his own. His movements were slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of a confession. "I didn't just survive, Audrey. I won." Audrey frowned, confusion knitting her brow. "Won? What do you mean?" "The news said Dominic betrayed your father. That it was a massacre." Gabriel took off his wet coat, tossing it over a dining chair. He stepped closer to her, the sheer magnetic pull of his presence overwhelming the small room. His grey eyes were intense, piercing through her. "Dominic planned to kill my father," Gabriel signed, his hands moving with deadly precision. "I have known about it for 6 months. Dominic discussed it openly with his capos. They thought I was deaf. They thought I was stupid. I let them plan. I let them bring the weapons inside." Audrey's breath hitched. "You knew? Why didn't you warn your father?" "My father allowed the Palermo cartel to cut my throat because he wouldn't negotiate over shipping routes," Gabriel signed, his face hardening into a mask of pure, cold fury. "He watched Dominic treat me like a dog for 10 years. My father was a monster. Dominic was worse. They were both going to burn the city to the ground." Audrey stared at him, the horrifying brilliance of his plan slowly dawning on her. Gabriel hadn't been a helpless victim in the corner. He had been a spider sitting quietly in the center of a massive invisible web. "So you let Dominic execute the hit," Audrey signed, slowly piecing it together. "And then?" "What?" "I had my own men waiting in the VIP lounge." Gabriel answered his gestures sharp and unapologetic. "Men loyal to my mother's side of the family, the Genovese faction. When Dominic went upstairs to celebrate his victory, they were waiting. The men who died in that ballroom were corrupt, violent animals. I removed the cancer from my family." He stepped even closer until there was barely an inch of space between them. Audrey had to crane her neck to look up at him. She expected to feel afraid. She had just invited the most dangerous, brilliant mob boss in New York into her home. But looking into his eyes, she saw the same man who had warned a stranger to run. "You are the boss now." She signed her fingers, brushing the air between them. "I am Gabriel confirmed. The commission recognized my claim yesterday. I gave them Dominic's ledgers. I gave them leverage. I bought peace. But it comes with a price. I have to clean up the blood." "Why are you here?" Gabriel, Audrey asked, dropping her hands, switching to spoken English, knowing he could hear her perfectly well. "You have an empire to run. You shouldn't be in a dingy apartment in Brooklyn." Gabriel reached out his massive, calloused hand, gently catching her chin. His thumb brushed lightly over her lower lip. It was an incredibly intimate, tender gesture from a man whose hands had just orchestrated the downfall of an entire crime syndicate. He didn't break eye contact as he brought his other hand up, signing the words with a slow, heavy reverence. "For 10 years, I screamed in a crowded room and no one heard me. Not my father. Not my brother. You were the first person who ever stopped to listen." He stepped back slightly, his expression turning deadly serious. "In my world, loyalty is bought with blood. But what you did walking into the shadows to talk to the ghost, that was something else. You are under my protection now, Audrey. No one in this city will ever touch you. But I needed to know." He paused, his hands hovering in the air, a rare flash of vulnerability crossing his aristocratic features. "I needed to know if you were afraid of the ghost now that he wears a crown." Audrey looked at the man standing before her, a ruthless king, a silent protector, a man who had endured a decade of humiliation just to protect the city from the monsters in his own bloodline. Slowly, deliberately, Audrey raised her hands, a fierce, defiant smile spreading across her lips. "I've never been afraid of the dark, Gabriel. and you've never been a ghost to me." Gabriel's chest heaved as he let out a silent, fractured breath. For the first time in his life, the invisible heir smiled a real, sweeping, breathtaking smile. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her hair, hiding from the world in the only place he had ever truly been seen. Audrey walked into the shadows and found a king. Gabriel tore down an empire in silence, but his loudest victory was winning the woman who truly heard him. Will the commission let the silent boss rule in peace, or is another war brewing? If you loved this intense mafia romance, hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling stories.